Welcome to the Sony 18-105 f4 G Master lens review, which is currently being shot on the Sony 18-105 f4 G Master lens. This is a Sony APS-C lens. It was released all the way back in 2013. Luckily, camera lenses do not lose their value as fast as camera bodies do, so this is still a very relevant lens today. It is one of the more expensive lenses that you can buy for the Sony APS-C lineup. However, it's one of the cheapest Sony G Master lenses. So if you do want that G Master premium quality without that high price tag, this might be that middle ground for you. Some comparable lenses I would say would be the Tamron 28-75 f2.8. This is a constant aperture. It's also a lower aperture than this Sony G Master. It, however, does not have power zoom and does not have optical steady shot. Another comparable lens, the Sony 18-135mm f3.5 to 5.6 lens. This lens has longer reach than the one that I'm reviewing today, and it also does come with optical steady shot. Its downfall is that it does not have a constant aperture as you zoom in, and it also doesn't have power zoom. So what would make you choose this lens over the alternatives that I've listed? One word: video. For video, I think that you need some sort of stabilization, you need a constant aperture, and you need power zoom. This lens has all three of these things. It's the only lens out of the ones that I've listed that have all three of these things. These are not cheap lenses. They're moving up a little bit in the price of APS-C lenses, but in the grand scheme, they are still budget lenses. So companies do still have to make sacrifices when making a lens at this price. So although this 18-105 doesn't stand out in any one area, it does a great job maintaining good quality in pretty much everything that you would ask it to do. So let's start off with the pros. Why would you buy this lens? I've already mentioned it, but I'll say it again: versatility. As I said earlier, this lens can do pretty much anything you ask of it at a decent level. For the aperture, f4 is not quite the fastest lens, but it's fast enough. It can be fast enough to get you nice looking bokeh if you just zoom in a little bit. It's fast enough to be able to survive slightly dim indoor situations. It can get the job done. 105mm is not the longest that you can get for a lens, especially at this price, but it's long enough for most scenarios, especially considering that Sony does clear image zoom particularly well, and it also, I mean, if you're shooting still photos on a 24 megapixel sensor, then you can crop pretty far in. I bought this lens a couple years ago, and because it's so versatile, it's pretty much been glued to my camera. I haven't really had a reason to take it off. I bring it with me everywhere I go unless I want to take portraits or something that requires a specialized prime lens. This is the lens I go with every time. Number 2, smoothness. If I could describe this lens in one word, it would be smooth. Between the constant aperture, the optical steady shot, and the power zoom, those three make this an extremely smooth lens, and every camera move and shot that you get with this lens, particularly in video, it just makes it look a little bit smoother, a little bit more cinematic and deliberate. The smoothness even extends to its build, which is mostly metal. It has two very nice rings on it, one of them to control focus, the other to control the zoom, and it also has Sony's power zoom switch. One thing to keep in mind, the zoom is motorized, both for the zoom ring and for the zoom switch. Another great part of the build is that the glass is completely encased. There's no moving parts. The lens doesn't have to move in and out of itself to zoom, which is really good for gimbals, but also just for the longevity of the lens and for your camera body. Lenses that move in and out of themselves have to breathe to be able to zoom, and lenses that breathe introduce dust to the inside of your lens, and which could also just get into your camera body, and these are both very annoying things to have to clean. So the encased lens with all the movement happening internally really just helps to minimize this dust, and it's a big upgrade over most Sony lenses that are not G Master lenses. And finally, the build just looks cool. It looks great. It has a nice, just awesome piece of glass in the front. It's huge, and at the very least, bare minimum, if you walk around with this lens, you will at least look like you know what you're doing. And this sounds like I'm just being funny, but it does help. In my experience, people are more likely to be aware of you and stay out of your shot if you're shooting with a nice lens like this one. Third, portability. At first glance, that's not gonna make any sense. I mean, look at the size of this thing. It's not a small lens. However, when you think of all the things that this lens can do, that's where it sort of makes sense that considering all of the features that it has, it's pretty portable, and you would need at least 2 zoom lenses or a few prime lenses to be able to cover everything that this lens can do, just packed into one single package. Also, the fact that all the movement occurs internally on this lens helps to make it a little bit more portable, and it makes it perfect for a walk around lens, a travel lens. If I am on a trip and I only have space for one lens, hands down, this is the lens I'm bringing every time. Let's move to the cons. What would stop you from buying this lens? And the first thing that I can think of is the minimum focus distance, which is 1.5 feet at the all the way wide angle, and zoomed all the way in it's 3 feet, which it doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're doing something like product photography or shooting B-roll for products, that's where it sort of gets in the way, because you do need to get sort of close to the subject if you want to make a nice bokeh. And once in a while I catch myself getting too close in to where I'm passing that, I'm getting inside of that minimum focus distance. That's one thing to look out for. It's not a macro lens whatsoever. Number 2, it might be too professional, and that sounds like I'm just saying, kind of like when you go to a job interview and you say, oh, well, my weakness is I work too hard, I care too much. But a lens looking too professional can actually be a disadvantage. For example, if I'm walking into a grocery store or a restaurant or any kind of event, if I walk in with just the 16 to 50 millimeter kit lens, for example, on an APS-C camera, that looks pretty much like a point and shoot, and I just look like I'm walking around as the guy who's just the guy walking around with a camera who's recording videos to show to his family. That guy is more likely to be allowed to go into an establishment than the guy who's walking around with a more professional, bigger looking lens. Because the guy with the bigger looking lens might be shooting professionally, or at the very least might be shooting a video or photos that will be seen by a lot more people. So if you're somewhere where you're allowed to shoot, or even better, you're being asked to shoot footage, this lens makes you look like a real professional. If you're in a place where you're not being asked to shoot and you're in a random restaurant, grocery store, anything like that, this lens makes you look like a real professional. See the difference there? And the third thing that would keep you from buying this lens, the wide focal length is just, it's nothing impressive. It doesn't get a great image all the way out at 18 millimeters. F4 is not enough to create much bokeh in most instances at 18 millimeters. Additionally, accounting for the APS-C crop factor, that 18 millimeter is not truly an 18 millimeter. It's the equivalent of a 27 millimeter if you're shooting with a full frame camera. So on paper, when you see F4, 18 millimeter, you're gonna start thinking landscape, architecture, real estate, things like that, but really it's a 27 millimeter equivalent for a full frame camera. So it doesn't get very wide. It does not make rooms look super huge like a true wide lens is supposed to do. So if you really are in a pinch, I guess you could use it for those things, but do not buy this lens for architecture, landscape, real estate, anything like that. There are much better lenses out there. I would say that the wide angle is probably the least impressive part of this lens. Final thoughts, this is my absolute favorite lens to use. It's the most fun lens that I've used, and I just, it might be my favorite thing that I've ever reviewed on this channel. I bought this lens a couple of years ago, and up until that point, I was just on it with research on the new lenses and what could I possibly get to up my content game. It's been a couple of years now, and I have not felt the need to keep up on lenses like I used to. I'm super satisfied with this lens. I have this lens and I have a 50mm f1.8, and between those two lenses, I can do absolutely everything that I need to do in terms of social media content, freelance work, anything like that. Those two lenses pretty much have me covered. In conclusion, if you're shooting portraits, buy a 50mm prime lens. If you're shooting wildlife, then buy a nice telephoto lens. If you're shooting real estate, buy a nice wide angle lens. But if you're doing any combination of these things and you're on a budget, try this lens out, because it's gonna save you a lot of money, it's gonna save you a lot of time, and it's gonna save you space as well. So I would highly recommend it. It's been a game changer for me. That's it for today's review. Thank you so much for watching, and if this has been valuable to you, please consider leaving a like, please consider subscribing, and I hope to see you again. Thanks.